Charles Guiteau's insane defense in court turned out to be a brutal forensic truth. I just shot him. The doctors killed him. James Garfield did not die from the gunshot wound. He was consumed by a prolonged necrotic process right in his sickbed. For 80 days, dirty, bare fingers, constantly probing the wound, turned the president's body into a massive hotbed of infection, rotting him from the inside out. James Abram Garfield was born in November 1831 in Orange Township, Ohio. He was the last U.S. president born in a log cabin. His father died when he was 18 months old, leaving the family in destitute poverty. He grew up sleeping on the dirt floor of a small shack in the wilderness. This harsh environment created a man of immense physical strength. Most children born into these conditions in the early 19th century were destined for a life of illiterate farming, if they survived childhood at all. But James Garfield possessed a hunger that terrified his mother. He didn't just want to survive, he wanted to consume the world. By the time he was a teenager, he was restless, aggressive, and incredibly strong. At 16, he ran away to work on the canals. This is the crucible that formed the man. The Ohio and Erie Canal was a rough, violent artery of commerce. Garfield worked as a driver, walking the towpath barefoot, whipping the mules that pulled the copper ore barges. He fell into the freezing water 14 times in 6 weeks. He fought with hardened boatmen. He slept in wet clothes and ate garbage. It was a life that broke weak men, but it turned Garfield into a physical specimen of immense durability. Yet inside this brawler's body was a mind that seemed to belong to a different species entirely. He returned from the canals, scraped together a few dollars, and entered the Geauga Seminary. The canal boy who smelled of mule sweat discovered he had a photographic memory. He devoured books. He learned Latin and Greek with a speed that baffled his instructors. By age 26, the boy who had once walked barefoot in the mud was the president of Hiram College. He was a lay preacher who could hold a congregation in the palm of his hand. He was a lawyer, and soon he would be a major general in the Union Army. There is a legend about Garfield that sounds like a myth, but witnesses swore it was true. He could take a pen in each hand and simultaneously write a sentence in Latin with his left hand and a sentence in Greek with his right. This ambidexterity was a party trick, but it symbolized something deeper, a brain that fired on all cylinders, all the time. He was a man of total capacity. When the Civil War broke out, he didn't hide behind his academic status. He raised a regiment, the 42nd Ohio, largely from his own students. He led them into battle at Middle Creek and Shiloh. He had horses shot out from under him. He stood in the rain of shrapnel and saw men vaporized by cannon fire. He survived dysentery, camp fever, and the sheer exhaustion of command. By 1881, James Garfield was 50 years old, but he had the vitality of a man half his age. He was 6 feet tall, 210 pounds of muscle, and resolve. He loved to eat, he loved to laugh, and he loved to wrestle with his teenage sons on the floor of the White House. He was the embodiment of the post-war American possibility, a man who had risen from the absolute bottom to the absolute top through sheer force of will. He was in every sense a survivor. He had survived starvation, the canals, the Civil War, and the ruthless combat of Congress. He was indestructible, or so it seemed. As he prepared for his summer vacation in July 1881, Garfield felt a sense of relief. The first few months of his presidency had been a nightmare of political infighting, but he had won. He had defeated his rival, Senator Roscoe Conkling. He had asserted the power of the presidency. He was looking forward to visiting his wife, Lucretia, who was recovering from malaria at the New Jersey shore. He was happy. He had no idea that while he was planning his reunion, a shadow was stalking him through the streets of Washington. A shadow wearing a cheap suit and carrying a delusion so powerful it would shatter the nation. The canal boy had survived everything the world threw at him, but he was not prepared for the two things that were about to collide with his back: a bullet from a madman and the dirty fingers of a doctor named Bliss. If James Garfield was the granite manifestation of the American dream, solid, self-made, and enduring, then Charles Julius Guiteau was the American nightmare. He was a vacancy in human form, a creature composed entirely of unearned ego and catastrophic failure. While Garfield was building a nation, Guiteau was drifting through it like a virus looking for a host. He was 40 years old in 1881, a small, wire-thin man standing barely 5 feet 5. His face was a map of nervous energy, twitching with a frantic, hidden frequency. His eyes were never still. By every objective metric of the 19th century, Guiteau was a wreck. He had tried to practice law in Chicago, a venture that consisted mostly of collecting debts for clients and then keeping the money for himself until the local bar association chased him out of town. He had tried to be a theologian, stealing the ideas of others and publishing a rambling, incoherent book called The Truth, which sold 0 copies. He drifted from boarding house to boarding house, leaving a trail of unpaid bills and stolen clothes in his wake. His failure was not just professional, it was primal. Years earlier, he had joined the Oneida community, the famous utopian sect in upstate New York. This was a commune dedicated to complex marriage, a system of free love where every man was married to every woman. It was a place designed for connection. Yet Guiteau was so physically repulsive, so socially toxic, and so manifestly unstable that the women of the commune universally refused to touch him. They nicknamed him Charles Gizmo, a useless gadget. Even in a society built on free love, he remained involuntarily celibate. His own father, a devout man, eventually wrote him off, believing his son was quite literally possessed by Satan. But Guiteau did not see a grifter when he looked in the mirror. He saw a titan. He suffered from a malignant, armor-plated narcissism that made him immune to reality. In his warped narrative, theft was merely aggressive business, and begging was the temporary embarrassment of a millionaire. He viewed himself not as a lunatic, but as a diplomat in waiting. This pathology found a fertile breeding ground in the Washington, D.C. of 1881. The capital was not the fortress of marble and security we know today. It was a swamp, a boom town of mud and ambition built on the spoils system. The federal government ran on a medieval loop of patronage. To the victor go the spoils. The moment a new president took office, the city was invaded by an army of office seekers. Men who had handed out flyers, men who had shouted at rallies, men who had simply voted. They all descended on the White House, demanding government salaries. They clogged the hallways, spitting tobacco juice on the carpets, sleeping in the corridors, and accosting cabinet members on the street. It was a chaotic bazaar of favors, and it was the only ecosystem where a parasite like Guiteau could thrive. Guiteau convinced himself that he was the architect of Garfield's victory. During the 1880 election, he had written a short, delusional speech titled Garfield Against Hancock. He had delivered it exactly once to a handful of confused pedestrians in a park who likely couldn't hear him over the traffic. But in the echo chamber of his mind, that single speech was the thunderclap that turned the tide of history. He believed he had made Garfield. Therefore, Garfield owed him, and the price was the consulship to Paris. He spoke no French, he had no diplomatic experience, he had never set foot in Europe, but he wanted the title, he wanted the status. He arrived in Washington on March 5th, 1881, the day after the inauguration, with no luggage and empty pockets, but walking with the swagger of a kingmaker. For the next 3 months, Guiteau haunted the executive mansion. Security was non-existent. The White House doors were open to the public. Guiteau would stroll in every morning, help himself to the free stationery in the waiting room, and write demanding letters to the president. "Mr. President," he would scrawl, "I will be at the White House this morning. I would like to see you about the Paris consulship." He treated the President of the United States not as a leader, but as a debtor who was late with a payment. He became a fixture of the lobby, a buzzing gnat that the administration couldn't quite swat away. He wore a suit that was shiny with grease and shoes that were falling apart, yet he moved through the halls of power as if he owned them. He ambushed the Secretary of State, James G. Blaine, on the street. He pestered the ushers. He slipped notes into the president's carriage. He was relentless, fueled by the terrifying energy of the desperate. The collision was inevitable. On May 14, 1881, Guiteau cornered Secretary Blaine in the hallway of the State Department. Blaine was a sharp-elbowed political brawler who had finally run out of patience. He turned on the little man and roared, "Never speak to me again about the Paris consulship as long as you live." For a rational man, this rejection would be the end. For Guiteau, it was an epiphany. He retreated to his vermin-infested boarding house, shivering in the dark. He did not blame his own incompetence. He did not blame Blaine. He blamed the president. A twisted narrative took root in his brain. Garfield was the problem. Garfield was ungrateful. Garfield was a traitor to the Republican Party. If Garfield were out of the way, Vice President Chester A. Arthur, a stalwart who loved the patronage system, would take over. And Arthur surely would recognize Guiteau's genius and hand him the keys to the Paris consulate. On a Wednesday night in June, the final gear clicked into place. Guiteau lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, when a thought hit him with the force of a physical blow. He later described it as a flash. A voice spoke to him. It was not his voice. It was the voice of the deity. "Remove the president." He sat up. He tasted the word, remove. He never used the word kill. Killers were criminals. Assassins were anarchists. Guiteau was neither. He was an employee of God. This was not a murder. It was a political necessity. It was a removal, a correction. The next morning, the failed lawyer went shopping for the instrument of his destiny. He walked into O'Mara's gun shop on the corner of 15th and F Streets. He told the clerk he needed a revolver that would make a loud noise. He wanted the world to hear him. The clerk placed a British Bulldog .44 caliber revolver on the glass counter. It was a brutish, heavy weapon, designed for stopping power at close range. There were two models available. One had a simple wooden grip and cost $9. The other had a grip made of polished ivory and cost $10. Guiteau had to borrow money just to eat. He was wearing socks with holes in them. Yet he hesitated. He looked at the wooden handle and then at the ivory. In that moment, his narcissism overrode his poverty. He was already thinking about the museum exhibit. He imagined this gun sitting in a glass case in the Smithsonian 50 years later with a plaque reading, "The gun that saved the Republic." A wooden handle would look pedestrian. An ivory handle would look presidential. He spent the extra $1. He bought the ivory-handled gun, a box of cartridges, and a penknife. He was curating his own legacy before the crime was even committed. Now armed, the divine agent began to hunt. But Guiteau was no marksman. He took the Bulldog down to the muddy banks of the Potomac River to practice. The first time he pulled the trigger, the massive recoil nearly knocked him over. The noise terrified him. He was a man afraid of his own weapon, flinching with every shot, firing wildly into the saplings. But the voice in his head was louder than the gun. He stalked Garfield for weeks. He became a shadow in the president's periphery. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, He followed Garfield to the Vermont Avenue Christian Church. He stood in the open doorway, his hand sweating on the ivory grip in his pocket. He watched the president's broad back as he bowed in prayer. He had a clear shot, but Guiteau held his fire. He later claimed he was worried about hitting an innocent bystander, but perhaps the sanctity of the church gave even his broken mind a moment of pause. Days later, on June 18th, he followed the president to the train station. Garfield was seeing his wife Lucretia off to a seaside resort. She was recovering from a brutal bout of malaria and looked frail, thin, and ghostly. Guiteau crept close, the gun heavy in his pocket. He watched the president tenderly kiss his sick wife goodbye. And then the monster showed a flicker of humanity that makes him even more chilling. He decided not to shoot. He looked at Mrs. Garfield's pale face and decided that killing her husband in front of her would be ungentlemanly. It might cause her to suffer a relapse. He tipped his hat and walked away. He was a murderer with a code of etiquette. He wanted to kill the president, but he didn't want to be rude about it. But the delay could not last. The pressure in Guiteau's mind was building to a breaking point. On July 1st, he sat on a bench in Lafayette Park, directly across from the White House, reading the morning newspaper. His eyes locked on a small notice in the Republican. The president was scheduled to leave for his summer vacation the next morning. He would be departing from the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station at 9:30 a.m. Guiteau folded the paper calmly. The waiting was over. The date was set. He went back to his boarding house and began to prepare his defense. He wrote a letter to the White House, a letter to the press, and a letter to General Sherman, the head of the army, asking for protection from the mob until the public realized he was a hero. He placed the letters in his pocket. He checked the cylinder of the British Bulldog. He went to sleep early and slept soundly, the sleep of a man who believes he is doing God's work. The swamp had created him. The system had ignored him. And now Charles Guiteau was ready to make them all pay. Saturday, July 2nd, 1881, dawned hot and heavy over Washington, D.C. It was the 4th of July weekend, and the air was already thick with humidity and the anticipation of holiday release. For President James Garfield, this was not just a weekend. It was a desperate escape. He had spent his first 4 months in office wrestling with the patronage sharks, sleeping little and aging visibly. But this morning, the political war was won. He was leaving the swamp. He woke up in high spirits, eating a hearty breakfast with his sons, laughing and wrestling with them one last time before his trip. He was heading north to New England, to his class reunion at Williams College, and then to the Jersey Shore to hold his wife's hand. As his carriage trotted down Pennsylvania Avenue at 9 a.m., accompanied by Secretary of State James G. Blaine, the president was leaning out of the window, waving to passers-by. Blaine later recalled that he had never seen the president so boyishly happy. He felt like a schoolboy let out for summer recess, unaware that his holiday would end in blood. While the president was enjoying the morning sun, Charles Guiteau was already waiting in the shadows of the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. The station, a red brick Gothic structure located on the National Mall, smelled of coal smoke and stale tobacco. Guiteau was eerily calm. He was not trembling. He had even stopped outside the station to have his boots shined, wanting to look presentable for the police. He checked his pockets one last time, feeling the cold weight of the ivory-handled revolver and the letters of explanation he had written to the American people. He instructed his hack driver to wait for him, fully expecting to be driven to the jail in style. He entered the station, surveyed the benches, and paced the floor, not with fear, but with the terrifying purpose of a man who believes he is an instrument of God. At 9:30 a.m., the presidential carriage arrived. Garfield and Blaine stepped onto the sidewalk. There were no bodyguards, no Secret Service agents forming a perimeter. In 1881, the president was viewed as the people's magistrate, and it was considered un-Republican to fence him off from the public. He walked unprotected, a massive target in a frock coat. They entered through the ladies' waiting room, a quieter side entrance with polished floors and high ceilings. Garfield was walking arm in arm with Blaine, deep in conversation, his head thrown back in laughter. He was halfway across the room when Guiteau stepped out from behind a wooden bench. Less than 6 feet away, Guiteau raised the British bulldog. He did not aim for the head or the heart. He simply pointed at the massive black shape of the president's back and squeezed the trigger. The first shot cracked through the air, deafening in the enclosed space, but it went wild, merely grazing Garfield's arm. The president spun around, the laughter dying on his lips. He looked at the small bearded man holding the smoking gun, his face registering not fear, but pure confusion. He gasped, "My God, what is this?" Guiteau did not answer. He took a step closer, leveled the gun again, and fired. This time, the aim was true. The heavy .44 caliber slug slammed into Garfield's back, just above the waist, 4 inches to the right of the spine. The impact was kinetic and brutal. Garfield's knees buckled immediately. He didn't fall. He crumbled, crashing face first onto the waiting room floor, his top hat rolling away into the dust. Pandemonium erupted instantly. Women screamed and fainted, while passengers scattered in terror. Secretary Blaine screamed, "My God, he has been murdered." Guiteau turned to run, heading for the exit where his cab was waiting, shoving the gun back into his pocket. But he ran straight into Patrick Kearney, a DC police officer who had heard the shots. Kearney grabbed the little man by the collar. Guiteau didn't fight. He looked up at the officer and shouted his rehearsed line, the line that proved his delusion. "I did it. I will go to jail for it. I am a stalwart, and Arthur is now president." As the police dragged him away from the lynching mob forming outside, the tragedy on the floor of the ladies' waiting room was shifting gears. The political crime was over. The medical crime was about to begin. Garfield was conscious, but he was in shock. He tried to vomit, his body violently rejecting the trauma, and a pool of bile and stomach acid began to form on the floor next to his face. He looked up at Blaine, his eyes wide with the realization of his own mortality, and whispered, "I am a dead man." But he was wrong. The anatomy of the wound tells a different story. The bullet had entered the back, fractured the 11th rib, and plowed through the soft tissue behind the abdominal cavity, finally coming to rest behind the pancreas encased in a layer of fat. Crucially, the bullet had missed the spinal cord, the intestine, and the aorta entirely. It was a sterile lead slug lodged in a safe place. If he had been left alone on that floor, the body would have walled off the bullet with a cyst, and he almost certainly would have survived. But he was not left alone. Within minutes, the first representative of the American medical establishment arrived, Dr. Smith Townsend, the local health officer. He rushed in from the street and knelt in the filth beside the president. He saw the hole in the president's coat. Calling for neither hot water, soap, nor alcohol, Dr. Townsend took fingers that had been touching the station floor, the door handles, and his own sweaty clothes, and inserted his unwashed pinky directly into the bullet hole in James Garfield's back. He probed deep, twisting his finger around in search of the bullet. He found nothing but bone splinters, but he left behind a massive colony of Staphylococcus bacteria. This was the first mistake, the inoculation of death. Townsend withdrew his finger and shook his head, declaring the president was dying. He ordered stimulants, pouring brandy and aromatic spirits of ammonia down the throat of a vomiting man, nearly choking him. Then came the second mistake. The doctors decided they had to move him upstairs to a private room. Lacking a stretcher, Workmen grabbed a mattress from the sleeping quarters of the station staff. It was an old horsehair mattress, stained, dusty, and teeming with mites and microbes from years of use by sweaty railroad conductors. 12 men lifted the bleeding president and laid him directly onto this filth. They carried him up the narrow stairs, jostling his broken rib with every step. For the next hour, Garfield lay on that dirty mattress in a stiflingly hot room, surrounded by a dozen doctors who had rushed to the scene. Each one wanted to be part of history, and one by one, they took turns inserting their unwashed fingers and unsterilized probes into the wound, widening the channel and pushing the bacteria deeper. Finally, a decision was made to transport him back to the White House. The cobblestones of Pennsylvania Avenue were too rough for a carriage, so they commandeered a horse-drawn army ambulance. But even that was too bumpy. In a moment of touching but tragic devotion, a frantic crowd of citizens unhitched the horses. 50 men grabbed the wheels and the tongue of the wagon and pulled the president by hand, walking slowly, avoiding every pothole, weeping as they dragged their fallen leader back to his home. They carried him inside, up the grand staircase, and placed him in his bedroom. He was pale and in agony, but he was alive. His constitution was fighting hard. He looked at his doctors and asked, "What are my chances?" Dr. Townsend didn't know, but the man who claimed to know was already on his way. A carriage was racing through the streets of Washington, carrying Dr. Willard Bliss. He was coming to take charge, and he was bringing with him an ego that was far deadlier than Guiteau's bullet. The shooting was over. The execution was about to begin. The man who walked into the White House bedroom that afternoon was not merely a physician. He was a force of nature, and a malignant one at that. His name was D. Willard Bliss, and in a strange twist of fate, his first name was actually Doctor. His parents had named him Dr. Willard Bliss, as if fate had stamped his passport before he could even crawl. He was tall, silver-haired, immaculately dressed in a dark frock coat, and possessed a voice that rumbled with absolute, unshakable authority. Without asking to treat the president or waiting to be summoned, he simply arrived, walked past the bewildered staff, and declared himself the captain of the ship. Bliss was a creature of the Civil War. He had served as a field surgeon in the Union Army, running the Armory Square Hospital in D.C., where he had sawed off limbs by the hundreds amidst the mud and screaming of the war. In that chaotic crucible, speed was valued over cleanliness, and authority was valued over curiosity. Bliss had learned medicine in an era where a surgeon's status was measured by the stiffness of his coat. The stiffer it was with dried blood and pus, the more experienced the doctor. He was a man of the old guard, a stalwart in politics, and a stalwart in medicine, rigid, conservative, and deeply suspicious of change. The tragedy of 1881 is that James Garfield was shot at the precise moment when two eras of medicine were colliding. Across the Atlantic, the Scottish surgeon Joseph Lister had already proven that invisible microbes caused infection. Lister pleaded with doctors to sterilize their instruments, to spray carbolic acid in the operating room, to wash their hands. In Europe, Listerism was saving lives. But in America, men like Bliss regarded the germ theory as an insulting fairy tale. They could not see germs, therefore germs did not exist. They believed that a gentleman's hands were naturally clean. To suggest that a doctor of high standing could kill his patient simply by touching him was considered a breach of etiquette. Bliss stood on the wrong side of history, and he stood there with his arms crossed. He believed in the doctrine of laudable pus. The medical establishment of the time taught that the thick, creamy discharge from a wound was a sign of a healthy immune response, a necessary stage of healing. They did not know it was actually the wreckage of white blood cells fighting a losing battle against massive bacterial invasion. Bliss was not just ignorant of the danger, he actively courted it. Upon entering the sick room, Bliss found the president in agony. The effects of the shock were wearing off, replaced by the searing pain of the broken rib and the internal tearing. A dozen other doctors were hovering, terrified of making a decision. Bliss pushed them aside. He approached the bedside. He did not look for a basin of water. He pulled a metal probe from his bag, a long, slender rod used to track bullet paths. He may have wiped it on a rag, or perhaps on his velvet lapel, but he certainly did not sterilize it. Bliss rolled the president onto his side. Garfield gritted his teeth. Bliss inserted the metal probe into the hole the bullet had made. He shoved it in, twisting it, trying to feel the lead. The probe hit an obstruction. Bliss pushed harder. Garfield cried out, his body seizing in pain. In this moment of brutal examination, Bliss made the diagnostic error that would doom the president. The bullet had actually traveled to the left, lodging safely behind the pancreas. But Bliss, perhaps misled by the way Garfield had turned when he was shot, became convinced that the bullet had traveled to the right, downward toward the liver. When his probe hit the shattered rib, he assumed he was feeling the track going right. He forced the instrument through healthy tissue, burrowing a new channel, a false passage, that ran nowhere near the bullet but opened up a pristine highway for infection deep into the president's pelvic basin. He withdrew the probe and made his pronouncement. "The ball is in the liver," he declared. "He will likely not survive the night." Having delivered this sentence, Bliss moved to consolidate his power. The president already had a personal physician, Dr. Jedediah Hyde Baxter. Baxter was a close friend of the Garfield family, a man who knew the president's body and history. When Baxter arrived at the White House, breathless and panicked, he rushed to the stairs. Bliss intercepted him at the top of the landing. The confrontation was short and brutal. Bliss blocked the way. He told Baxter that the president had personally put him, Bliss, in charge. This was a lie. Garfield was too drugged and in too much pain to choose anyone. But Bliss was an imposing figure, and Baxter was a gentleman. Bliss physically barred him from the room. The president's own doctor was sent away, never allowed to treat the patient he had sworn to protect. By the evening of July 3rd, Dr. Bliss had established a medical dictatorship. He dismissed the other attending physicians, keeping only a small circle of sycophants who wouldn't question his judgment. He set up a strict quarantine. No one was allowed in. He even restricted the First Lady's access to her husband. He controlled the bulletins to the press, painting a picture of his own heroic management, while the president lay sweating in a bed that was rapidly becoming a biohazard. The atmosphere in the White House began to change. The windows were open to the swampy heat of the Potomac. The room was dark, heavy with the smell of blood and brandy. Bliss instituted a regimen of heavy dosing with morphine and quinine. The morphine dulled the pain, but it also paralyzed the president's bowels, which were already in shock. The quinine was for malaria, a disease Garfield didn't have, but Bliss administered it anyway because it was what he knew. As the first week passed, the president did not die, as Bliss had predicted. The man of iron was fighting back. His temperature fluctuated. He was lucid. He cracked jokes with the nurses. But deep inside his back, in the tunnel created by the unwashed fingers of Dr. Townsend and the unwashed probe of Dr. Bliss, the staphylococcus bacteria were multiplying. They were feeding on the blood and the bruised tissue, building an army that would soon overwhelm the strongest constitution in America. Bliss looked at the wound. It was beginning to ooze. He nodded with satisfaction. Laudable pus, he told the press. He thought he was seeing healing. He was actually watching the president begin to rot. The medical crime had been committed. Now the cover-up and the slow torture would begin. The White House was no longer a seat of government. It was a torture chamber run by a man who believed he could do no wrong. If the shooting was a moment of chaotic violence, the treatment that followed was a slow, organized torture. By the second week of July, the White House had transformed into a grim hospital ward. The windows were draped with heavy curtains to dampen the noise of the carriages on Pennsylvania Avenue, creating a stifling twilight atmosphere where time seemed to bleed together. In the center of this gloom lay the president, a man of immense vitality who was being systematically dismantled by the very people sworn to save him. The horror of James Garfield's summer was not just the pain, it was the routine of it. Under the direction of Dr. Bliss, a twice-daily ritual was established. They called it dressing the wound. In reality, it was a biological assault. Every morning and every evening, Bliss and his assistants would approach the bedside. With unscrubbed hands and unboiled instruments, they simply pulled back the sheets to expose the angry, red hole in the president's back and began their work. Bliss was obsessed with keeping the wound open. He believed that if the hole healed over, the bad humors would be trapped inside. So twice a day he would force a catheter, a hard rubber tube, into the bullet track. When the catheter wouldn't go deep enough to satisfy him, he would use his fingers. He would push, twist, and gouge, breaking through the delicate granulating tissue that the body was desperately trying to form to close the wound. Garfield, a man who had endured the carnage of the Civil War without flinching, would grip the sides of the mattress until his knuckles turned white. He would bite down on a towel to keep from screaming, sweat pouring off his forehead. He described the sensation as a tiger clawing at his vitals. Yet Bliss persisted, convinced that this brutality was necessary to drain the laudable pus. But the pus was not laudable. It was the byproduct of a losing war. Inside the president's body, the Staphylococcus bacteria introduced by the unwashed fingers were feasting. They had colonized the false passage. The tunnel Bliss had accidentally bored into the healthy tissue on the right side of the body. This tunnel was now a festering canal, 4 inches deep and growing longer every day. It was a dead-end street filled with blood, necrotic flesh, and millions of bacteria. It was a poison factory, and every time Bliss squeezed the wound to drain it, he was inadvertently forcing some of that poison back into the president's bloodstream. To legitimize his regime, Bliss allowed 2 other prominent surgeons to consult, Dr. D. Hayes Agnew and Dr. Frank Hamilton. These were men of high reputation, the titans of American surgery. The public hoped they would bring reason to the sick room. Instead, they brought capitulation. When Agnew and Hamilton arrived, they did not challenge Bliss. They deferred to him. They, too, poked their unwashed fingers into the wound. They, too, felt the resistance of the false passage and agreed with Bliss's erroneous conclusion that the bullet was lodged on the right side. They signed off on his treatment plan. It was a conspiracy of politeness. No one wanted to insult the chief surgeon by suggesting he wash his hands or that his diagnosis was wrong. They chose professional etiquette over the president's life. By late July, the consequences of this malpractice became visible. The president began to shake. These were not simple shivers. They were violent rigors that rattled the heavy bed frame. His temperature spiked to 104 degrees. He was drenched in sweat, then freezing cold. To a modern medical student, or even a European doctor of that era, the diagnosis was screamingly obvious: septicemia, blood poisoning. The infection was spreading from the abscess in his back into his circulatory system. The president was rotting from the inside out, but Bliss refused to see it. He diagnosed the fever as malarial. He claimed it was the bad air of the Potomac swamp affecting the president. So instead of draining the infection or cleaning the wound, he prescribed massive doses of quinine. The bitter drug did nothing for the sepsis, but it wreaked havoc on Garfield's digestive system. It caused nausea, ringing in the ears, and terrible abdominal cramping. They were poisoning a man who was already fighting a lethal infection. The president's appetite vanished. The sight of food made him gag. The man who had loved hefty meals of steak and potatoes now turned his head away from broth. His weight began to plummet. The layers of fat and muscle that had protected him were melting away, consumed by the metabolic furnace of the fever. Yet, amidst this physical degradation, Garfield's mind remained tragically clear. He knew he was fading. He began to ask the doctors pointed questions they couldn't answer. "Why does the wound not heal?" he whispered. "Why am I so weak?" Bliss would pat his hand and offer platitudes, telling him he was improving splendidly. It was a gaslighting of the highest order. The president lay in his own sweat, smelling the sweet, rotting odor of his own infection, a scent that was beginning to permeate the room, while his doctors smiled and told him he was getting better. The turning point into absolute horror came when the stomach finally rebelled. The constant vomiting meant Garfield could no longer keep down water or medicine. He was dehydrating. He was starving. And Dr. Bliss, ever the innovator of bad ideas, decided that if the president could not be fed through his mouth, he would be fed from the other end. The order was given. The torture was about to move from the wound in his back to a final humiliating assault on his dignity. The era of rectal feeding was about to begin, marking the descent from medical tragedy into the grotesque. By August, the medical treatment of the president had descended into a realm of grotesque absurdity. The man who had once been a dynamo of energy, capable of debating policy while writing Greek and Latin simultaneously, was now a starving skeleton trapped in a bed that smelled of death. The vomiting caused by the septic infection had made it impossible for him to retain food. His stomach, ravaged by morphine and quinine, had shut down. But rather than addressing the root cause, the rotting hole in his back, Dr. Bliss decided to bypass the stomach entirely. He ordered a regimen of rectal alimentation. It was a polite medical term for a barbaric procedure. Every 4 hours, day and night, the doctors would roll the president onto his side and force a heavy rubber tube into his rectum. Through this tube, they injected a thick, warm slurry of beef bouillon, egg yolks, milk, and whiskey. Bliss believed, against all physiological logic, that the lower intestine could digest this complex mixture and absorb the nutrients. He was wrong. The colon is designed to absorb water, not steak and eggs. The result was not nourishment, it was torture. The mixture sat in the president's bowel, fermenting and putrefying in the summer heat. The whiskey irritated the delicate lining of the intestine, causing agonizing colic and violent spasms that racked Garfield's already broken body. The president begged them to stop. He told them he felt like he was being torn apart from the inside. But Bliss, with the arrogance of a man who cannot admit error, insisted the feedings continue. The room began to reek of unprocessed waste and flatulence, a humiliation that stripped the last shreds of dignity from the leader of the free world. Under this regime of starvation disguised as science, James Garfield began to vanish. When he entered the White House, he weighed 210 pounds. By mid-August, he had dropped below 130 pounds. His cheeks hollowed out. His eyes sank deep into their sockets. The magnificent muscles of his arms and legs, forged on the canal towpaths of Ohio, withered away until the skin hung loose on his bones like wet drapery. He was literally cannibalizing himself, his body consuming its own muscle tissue in a desperate bid to keep the heart beating. Then the sepsis moved to its next target. The Staphylococcus bacteria, having turned the back wound into a swamp, hitched a ride in the bloodstream and found a new home in the parotid gland, located just behind the right ear. It started as a small lump. Within days, it had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. The pressure on the facial nerves was immense. Garfield's face became paralyzed on the right side, drooping into a slack, lifeless mask. He could no longer close his right eye. He could not smile. The pain was blinding. A constant throbbing pressure inside his skull that no amount of morphine could silence. On August 24th, the abscess could no longer contain the infection. It burst. But it didn't just burst outward. It ruptured internally. A foul stream of pus began to pour out of the president's right ear. It leaked into his throat, causing him to choke on his own corruption. It even seeped out of the corner of his eye. The President of the United States was literally leaking pus from every orifice of his head. Dr. Bliss's solution was to reach for the knife again. Without anesthesia, because the president was too weak to withstand it, Bliss took a scalpel and sliced open the president's face to drain the gland. He made several incisions, carving through the swelling. The relief was temporary, but the damage was permanent. The handsome, bearded face of James Garfield was now a ruined landscape of surgical scars, paralysis, and weeping sores. The horror of the situation was total. The president was a conscious prisoner in a rotting body. He knew he was dying. He looked at his hands, now just translucent claws, and whispered to his friend, "I am a shadow." Yet in the hallway, Dr. Bliss continued to issue bulletins to the press, claiming that the president was resting comfortably and that the symptoms were merely minor complications. It was a lie of monumental proportions. Inside the sick room, the smell of decaying flesh was so overpowering that the nurses had to soak their handkerchiefs in cologne just to breathe. The president was not recovering. He was liquefying. But even in this darkest hour, there was one final flickering candle of hope. A man of science, a true genius who represented everything Dr. Bliss was not, had been working feverishly in a laboratory across town. He believed he could find the bullet that the doctors had missed. He believed he could save the president with a machine that had never been used before. Alexander Graham Bell was coming to the White House, and he was bringing the future with him. While Dr. Bliss was busy carving the president with his scalpel, a different kind of mind was at work in a laboratory on Connecticut Avenue. Alexander Graham Bell was 34 years old, already famous as the inventor of the telephone, and arguably the most brilliant man in America. He had been following the medical bulletins with growing horror. He realized that the doctors were flying blind, digging into the president's body because they could not locate the lead bullet. Bell approached the problem not as a surgeon, but as a physicist. He didn't need to cut flesh. He needed to detect metal. He threw himself into a frenzy of invention. Working day and night with his assistant, Charles Tainter, Bell developed a device he called the induction balance. It was a crude, terrifyingly complex contraption consisting of batteries, condensers, coils of wire, and a telephone receiver. The theory was elegant. If the two coils were balanced perfectly, the telephone receiver would be silent. But if a metallic object, like a lead bullet, entered the field of the coils, it would disturb the balance, causing the receiver to emit a humming sound. It was the world's first metal detector, built specifically to save the life of James Garfield. On July 26th, Bell brought his machine to the White House. He was anxious. The device was finicky, and the heat in Washington was oppressive. But the real obstacle was not the humidity, it was Dr. Bliss. From the moment Bell arrived, Bliss treated him with thinly veiled contempt. To Bliss, Bell was an interloper, a non-medical man trying to use magic tricks to solve a problem that belonged to surgeons. Bliss reluctantly allowed Bell into the sick room, but imposed strict conditions. He was the gatekeeper, and he would dictate how the science was used. They carried the heavy batteries and coils into the president's bedroom. Garfield looked at the machine with weak, hopeful eyes. He was a lover of technology, a man who had once been fascinated by the telephone. He whispered to Bell, "Thank you so much for the trouble you have taken." Bell, moved to tears by the president's gaunt appearance, adjusted his headset. He began to sweep the wooden paddle over the president's body. Almost immediately, he heard a faint hum. He moved it again, a hum. He moved it to a different spot, another hum. The machine was signaling metal everywhere. Bell was baffled. He checked his connections. He retuned the coils. He tried again. The result was a confusing cacophony of static. The device seemed to be failing. Bliss watched with crossed arms, a smirk playing on his lips. He had expected this failure. What neither man realized, and what Bliss certainly didn't care to investigate, was that they were fighting an invisible enemy beneath the sheets. In a tragic twist of modernization, the White House had recently purchased a new mattress for the president. Unlike the old straw or horsehair beds of the past, this was a luxury coil spring mattress supported by a grid of steel wires. Bell's sensitive machine wasn't detecting the bullet. It was detecting the bed itself. The steel springs were overwhelming the sensor. If Bliss had simply allowed the president to be moved to a canvas cot or even placed on the floor, the device would have worked perfectly. But Bliss did not suggest it, and Bell, unaware of the mattress's construction, left the White House in humiliation, believing his invention was a failure. But Bell was not a man to give up. He went back to his lab, barely sleeping. He tweaked the sensitivity. He tested it on Civil War veterans who still carried bullets in their bodies, and it worked flawlessly. Convinced he could still save the president, he returned to the White House on August 1st for a second attempt. This time, the sabotage was deliberate. Bell pleaded with Bliss to let him scan the entire torso. He wanted to sweep the left side of the president's back, where the autopsy would later prove the bullet was hiding. But Dr. Bliss refused. He was dogmatic in his diagnosis. The bullet was on the right. He told Bell that the president was too exhausted to be moved or rolled over. He grabbed Bell's hand and physically guided the wand only over the right side of the body, the side of the false passage, the side with no bullet. Bell scanned the empty area. Silence. The machine detected nothing because there was nothing there to detect. Bliss seized upon this silence as vindication. He announced that the bullet was buried so deep in the liver that it was beyond reach, and therefore no further surgery should be attempted to retrieve it. He ushered Bell out of the room, dismissing the greatest inventor of the age like a naughty schoolboy. Bell returned to his lab, crushed. He wrote in his diary about his deep sense of failure. He didn't know that his machine had worked perfectly. He didn't know that the only thing blocking the signal was the ego of the attending physician. The induction balance was packed away, and with it, the last scientific hope for James Garfield. The doctors had rejected the future. Now they were left with the ancient, rotting past. The president was alone again with the knife. By the beginning of September, the White House had ceased to be a residence and had become a sepulcher. The heat of the Washington summer had not broken, hanging over the Potomac swamp like a wet wool blanket. Inside the executive mansion, the air was heavy with the smell of antiseptics, stale bedding, and the unmistakable sweet rotting odor of gangrene. The president was no longer fighting for his life. He was enduring his death. He was a skeleton wrapped in skin, weighing barely 130 pounds. His face a ravaged mask of scars and paralysis. But his mind, cruel in its clarity, remained intact. He knew he was trapped. On September 5th, James Garfield made one final desperate exertion of will. He looked at Dr. Bliss, who was still issuing optimistic lies to the press, and whispered a command that could not be ignored. "I must get out of this heat," he gasped. "The sea. Take me to the sea." He wanted to go to Elberon, New Jersey, a quiet resort town where the Atlantic breeze might blow away the smell of his own decay. The doctors protested, citing his fragility, but the president was adamant. It was the plea of a dying man who wanted to see the sky one last time. What followed was a logistical miracle born of national devotion. The Pennsylvania Railroad Company mobilized an army of workers. In less than 24 hours, 2,000 men worked through the night, swinging sledgehammers by torchlight to build a specialized spur line. They laid tracks that branched off the main line in Elberon and ran directly down the street, across the lawns of the luxury cottages, right up to the front door of the Franklin cottage where the president would stay. They were building a railroad to a deathbed. On the morning of September 6th, the transfer began. It was a scene of haunting solemnity. The president was carried out of the White House on a stretcher. He was so light that the bearers barely felt his weight. They loaded him onto a specially modified train car where the seats had been removed and a bed suspended from the ceiling by heavy rubber straps, designed to absorb the shock of the steel wheels. As the train prepared to leave the station, the engineers realized that the noise of the steam engine chugging might distress the president. In a spontaneous act of reverence, the engine was uncoupled. Hundreds of silent citizens, men in suits, laborers in overalls, soldiers in uniform, stepped forward. They placed their hands on the back of the train car. In total silence, without a whistle or a shout, the crowd pushed the president's train out of the station and onto the main line, moving the heavy iron beast with nothing but muscle and grief until the engine could safely reattach far outside the city. The journey north was a race against the sun. The train thundered through the countryside at nearly 60 miles per hour, a terrifying speed for the time because Dr. Bliss believed the rushing air would help the president breathe. Crowds lined the tracks in Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. They did not cheer. As the train passed, men removed their hats and women wept into their aprons. It was a rolling funeral for a man who was not yet dead. Inside the car, Garfield lay with his eyes closed, the vibrations dampened by the rubber straps drifting in and out of consciousness. They arrived in Elberon in the late afternoon. The train rolled onto the hastily built spur line, the wheels screeching softly as they crossed the manicured lawns of the seaside resort. The car stopped mere feet from the porch of the Franklin cottage. The president was carried inside and placed in a bed positioned in front of a massive bay window. For a brief, heartbreaking moment, it seemed to work. Garfield opened his eyes. He saw the Atlantic Ocean, gray and vast, stretching out to the horizon. He smelled the salt air. A faint smile touched the unparalyzed side of his face. "This is good," he whispered. "I am myself again." For 2 days, there was a cruel surge of hope. The president sat up. He asked for food. The sea breeze seemed to have done what Dr. Bliss's knives could not. But it was the Lazarian rally, the final sudden burst of energy that often precedes the end. The sepsis was too deep. The canal of death in his back had not vanished. It had merely traveled with him. The bacteria were deep in his blood, clustering in his heart, waiting for the final blow. By the second week of September, the shadow returned. The fever spiked. The chills shook the bed so violently that the doctors had to hold him down. The view of the ocean, once a comfort, became a taunt, a symbol of the vast, cold eternity that was waiting for him. The escape was over. The destination had been reached. Now, there was nothing left to do but die. By the middle of September, the Franklin cottage in Elberon had become a house of whispers. The carpets were thick to muffle footsteps. The servants communicated in hand signals. The only sound that could not be silenced was the rhythmic, indifferent crashing of the Atlantic waves against the shore just a few hundred feet away. Inside the master bedroom, the man who had been the strongest president since Washington was reduced to a husk of skin and bone, weighing barely 120 pounds. He was no longer James Garfield, the scholar general. He was a biological ruin, a testament to 80 days of medical malpractice. The end did not come with the gradual fading of the light, as the poets might describe. It came with the violent mechanical breakdown of a machine that had been pushed past its breaking point. The sepsis had done its work. The Staphylococcus bacteria had not just poisoned his blood, they had weakened the structural integrity of his circulatory system. Deep inside his torso, near the site of the infection, the wall of the splenic artery, a major vessel supplying blood to the spleen, had been eaten away. It was ballooning out, forming a massive aneurysm, a ticking time bomb of blood waiting to burst. September 19th, 1881, began as a day of eerie calm. The president was lucid, but weak. He asked for a mirror. When he saw his own reflection, the sunken eyes, the gray skin, the beard matted with sweat, he did not weep. He simply handed the glass back to the nurse and said, "It is strange." He knew he was looking at a ghost. As the sun set, casting long purple shadows across the ocean, a chill wind picked up. The doctors lit the gas lamps, casting flickering shadows on the walls. General David Swaim, Garfield's chief of staff and closest friend, took the night watch. He sat by the bedside, watching the chest of his commander rise and fall in shallow, ragged breaths. Dr. Bliss, exhausted and perhaps sensing the futility of his own arrogance, had retired to his room. At 10:10 p.m., the president woke with a start. His eyes were wide, filled with a sudden, terrifying clarity. He clutched his chest. The aneurysm had ruptured. "Oh, Swaim," he cried out, his voice thin but frantic. "There is a terrible pain here." He pressed his skeletal hand over his heart. "Oh, Swaim, can't you stop this?" It was the final plea of a man who had trusted his friends to save him and who had been betrayed by their incompetence. Swaim jumped up and called for the doctors. Bliss rushed in, wearing his nightclothes. He took one look at the president and froze. For the first time in 80 days, the arrogance vanished from Dr. Bliss's face, replaced by the cold realization of defeat. The president's face had turned a ghastly gray. His pulse was fluttering like a dying bird, thready and impossibly fast. The internal hemorrhage was massive. The blood that should have been keeping him alive was pouring into his abdominal cavity, drowning him from the inside. Garfield looked at Bliss. He gasped for air, his chest heaving. "Doctor," he whispered, "am I dying?" Bliss, the man who had lied to the press, lied to the public, and lied to his patient for 3 months, finally told the truth. "Dear Mr. President," he said softly, "you are very near the end." Garfield closed his eyes. There was no struggle, nor any final prayer, only one long, shuddering exhale. At 10:35 p.m., the heart of James Abram Garfield stopped beating. The canal boy, the professor, the general, the president, he was gone. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the sobbing of his wife Lucretia, who buried her face in the chest of the corpse. Dr. Bliss reached over and stopped the clock on the mantelpiece. He then walked to the window and signaled to the reporter waiting on the lawn. Within minutes, the telegraph lines began to hum. The message went out to New York, to Chicago, to San Francisco. The president is dead. Across the nation, church bells began to toll. In the deep night, citizens woke up to the sound of mourning. The long agony, as the newspapers called it, was over. But for the doctors, the reckoning was just beginning. The body was transported back to Washington, D.C., not for a state funeral, but for the final reckoning, the autopsy. This was the moment Dr. Bliss had been dreading. For 80 days, he had staked his reputation on a single diagnosis, that the bullet was buried in the liver on the right side. He had tortured the president based on this one assumption. Now the knife would reveal the truth. On the afternoon of September 20th, 1881, a group of somber men gathered in a makeshift operating room in Franklin Cottage. The air was thick with the scent of formaldehyde and the unspoken tension of a courtroom verdict. Dr. D.S. Lamb, a pathologist from the Army Medical Museum, stood over the emaciated corpse of the president. Watching him like a hawk was Dr. D. Willard Bliss. For 80 days, Bliss had staked his reputation on a single, unwavering diagnosis. The bullet was buried in the liver on the right side of the body. He had directed every probe, every incision, and every treatment based on this certainty. Now, the knife would reveal the truth. Dr. Lamb made the incision. He opened the chest and abdominal cavity. The first thing the doctors noticed was the liver. It was pristine. There was no bullet. There was no damage. Bliss's face went pale. The organ he had insisted was the seat of the injury was untouched. Then they looked at the track of the wound. What they found was a horror show of medical incompetence. Running along the right side of the spine, downward toward the pelvis, was a massive, pus-filled channel, a sinus tract nearly 20 inches long. It was a tunnel of rotting flesh, filled with bone fragments and gallons of sepsis. But here is the tragedy. This tunnel did not align with the bullet hole. It was a false passage. It was the channel created by Dr. Bliss's metal probe and Dr. Townsend's unwashed finger on the very first day. The infection that killed the president lived entirely in this man-made canal. Finally, after searching for nearly an hour, Dr. Lamb found the bullet. It was hiding on the left side of the body, completely the opposite of where Bliss had insisted. It lay harmlessly behind the pancreas, encased in a tough cyst of scar tissue. The body had done its job. It had walled off the intruder. The bullet itself was sterile and inert. If the doctors had simply washed the wound, put a bandage on it, and left the president alone, James Garfield would have recovered in a few weeks. He died not from the assassination attempt, but from the medical attempt. The autopsy report was a death sentence for Dr. Bliss's career. The medical community was aghast. The New York Medical Record published a scathing editorial, stating that the president has been the victim of a systemic poisoning. The public turned on the chief surgeon. Bliss spent the rest of his life trying to defend his actions, writing papers and giving interviews. But he died a pariah, remembered only as the man whose arrogance killed a president. But there was one man who felt vindicated by the autopsy, Charles Guiteau. The trial of the assassin began in November 1881. It was a circus. Guiteau sang songs in court, insulted his own defense team, and compared himself to the Apostle Paul. He became a celebrity, signing autographs for the spectators. But his defense strategy was shockingly lucid. When the autopsy results were read, showing the harmless bullet and the deadly infection caused by the doctors, Guiteau stood up and shouted his most famous line, "The doctors killed Garfield. I just shot him." Legally, it didn't matter. Under the law of 1881, if you start the chain of events that leads to a death, you are guilty of murder. The jury deliberated for only an hour. Guilty. Guiteau was sentenced to hang. On June 30th, 1882, Charles Guiteau walked up the scaffold in Washington, D.C. He recited a poem he had written for the occasion, titled, "I Am Going to the Lordy." He smiled as the hood was placed over his head. The trapdoor opened, and the man who wanted a consulship got a rope instead. His brain was removed, preserved in a jar, and sits today in a museum in Philadelphia, a physical remnant of a twisted mind. But the true legacy of James Garfield's death is not the hanging of a madman. It is the revolution of a profession. The sheer public horror of the president's 80-day torture broke the resistance of the American medical establishment. The old guard, who scoffed at germs, could no longer defend their dirty hands. The evidence was too grotesque. The contrast between the clean bullet and the rotten probe was too stark. Within a decade, Listerism, the practice of sterile surgery, became the standard in American hospitals. Doctors began to boil their instruments. They began to wear masks. They began to wash their hands. The death of James Garfield was the sacrificial event that dragged American medicine out of the dark ages and into the modern era. Today, if a president were shot in the same spot as James Garfield, he would be in surgery for 2 hours to remove the bullet and clean the wound. He would be on antibiotics for a week. He would be back in the Oval Office within a month. James Garfield was a man of immense potential, a what-if of history. He was a scholar, a soldier, and a statesman who believed in the unity of the nation. His presidency is often dismissed as a footnote, a short interlude between other men. But his contribution was physical. He offered his body to the altar of science. He suffered the unimaginable so that the rest of us wouldn't have to. Every time a surgeon scrubs in, every time a nurse opens a sterile package, every time a patient survives a gunshot wound without infection, they are unknowingly paying tribute to the president who rotted alive. James Garfield died both for his nation and by its medical ignorance, a sacrificial tragedy that ultimately saved the future.